So I was just saying, I'm kind of getting my colors mixed up here. I'm going to be using cobalt blue, yellow ochre, and burnt sienna. And I might add a little cobalt turquoise, but I'm going to try not to. I'm going to try and just simplify this. I'm kind of approaching this as I would a plein air painting. Basically, it's going to be capturing the light in the scene first, simplifying the details and textures, keeping the textures more interesting on the focal point, but kind of simplifying everything else. I'm going to jump right into it. So I've got a mix of cobalt blue and burnt sienna here. I'm just basically looking for a cool neutral. These are going to be the clouds. I may need to mix more of that, but what I'm going to do first, I'm going to paint around the highlights here. So I'm going to save the highlight on this part of the silo, on this part of the roof, and on this part of the barn. And so the first thing I'm going to paint is the sky, top to bottom, except for it's actually going to be a little different because I'm going to be painting the dark down in this area, and then it's going to get lighter. So I'm going to wet the whole sky all the way down to the horizon, behind the trees, right through the shadow side of the silo and the shadow side of the barn. And I'm going to go in with this mix, a nice cool dark mix, and I'm really going to put the bulk of it on this area here, and then have it fade out, sort of like you see there. And on this one, I didn't paint through the shadow of the silo, but I'm going to do that this time, just to eliminate that little edge. I can always come in and lift a little highlight if I want to, or I can lift this if I need to. I can adjust as needed, but I think that way it'll be all tied in and connected, which is nice. So to start, I'm going to spritz with my fine mist sprayer just to get some water down. And then just a kind of a soft flat brush, which is going to give me some, allow me to work around these edges a little bit. And what I'm going to do to make this easier on myself is I'm going to turn it upside down. You'll notice I'm going to spin this board around a lot, but I said I just want to start from the horizon. I'm going to go right into the shadow side of that silo. I'm going to across the top. And I'm going to paint around this top part of the roof. So I'm going to leave that dry, and I want to work around this part of the silo, but I do want to get some color down there. And as I'm going here, I'm going to keep kind of going back to the start and make sure that that's not drying off too quickly. Right through the trees. And then down to that base of the tree line there. And that looks nice and even. Great. And I'm just tipping the paper and looking at where the glare is to make sure it's kind of evenly wet. Get rid of some of the excess around the edge. And because I want it to kind of go dark to light, I'm going to let gravity help me out. And I'm going to tip this upside down and start working around these edges. I'm working with as big a brush as I can here, a 2-inch Hake or Hake. One of the downsides of these bigger flat brushes, a lot of times I notice, is that when you lift the brush up, it'll flick little drips. So I've got a paper towel handy in case I get some drips in this area that I want to save. Actually, I need to go into the barn here, onto the shadow side. And the shadow on the barn and on the side and on the roof, on this part of the roof, not that part. We're going to connect down here to everything else. And I'm even going to wet into the highlight here. I'm going to soften that edge. So I'm okay with that. I just want to keep that dry, and then the ground will come back in and do all at the same time there. But I want to make sure there's some moisture there. All right. Now it's time for paint. And what I'll do is, like I said, I'm going to use the biggest brush I can. I've got a 2-inch hake here, and I'm going to, where needed, like if I want to get into some of these details, I'll come in with a smaller brush, use the same puddle, and just get into some of those tighter edges. But I really want to put this down as quickly as possible. So I'll start there. And there you can see that's going to be in the shadow edge. That's fine. And so you can see all these little drips. And I'm really just focused on painting around this barn shape here and down to the horizon. I'm going to let this soften out anyway, so I don't need to worry about that right now. There's enough moisture in there. I'll be able to go back and work with that. There we go. Just like that. Get rid of some of these random little drops. Get rid of some of this excess. And then I'll come back with a fineness sprayer and just let that edge do what it's going to do. I'll come in with I'm going to use the same brush. Get into here. And you can see the buckles in the paper, they're going to start to settle some pigment. So I'm going to keep tilting the board to try and eliminate the gullies from forming there. And my guess is I'm going to have to come back in and glaze this later again, but that's all right. This is just making all these connections, connecting all the darks, all the shadow shapes. There we go. And as I'm tipping the board, I'm just looking at the water that's running around the edge, and I'm going to clean all that up so it doesn't run back into the painting. And it. A little hair or something that came off a brush, I think, in there, but I'll put some trees in there, so I'm not worried about that. I think what I'll do is I'm just going to tip the paper. My board here is at a bit of an angle. It's about maybe 15 degrees. It's not much, but I'm going to tip this and then put a roll of tape under the top edge just to give it more angle. I'm trying to eliminate that from turning into a dark spot. We'll see how that goes. And as soon as I can, I'm going to come in and start putting some trees in. I think I'm going to do it now. I may end up with a little bit of a dark spot there, but that's all right. I'll keep the board tilt like on its side a little bit. So just bear with me. I know I'm not getting the whole thing in frame, but let's see, there we go. So while this is wet, I think what I better do is hit it with a hairdryer because this is really where these low spots are, the only real wet areas. It's kind of dried too much here. And what I want to do is come in with some thick paint for the tree shape in the background. And I'm going to simplify this and kind of do it all in one go, all the way from left to right, working around the silo and around the barn. And then what I'll probably do, I'm going to go ahead and hit it with a hairdryer real quick. And then I'll come back when I paint those, when I paint that tree shape, I'll come in with a damp brush or something and soften some of the edges in the top, just to kind of set it in there. But at this point, I can tell I'm too dry here and too dry here to go in with any kind of moisture. I'll just cause problems. So I'm going to hit it with a hairdryer and just bear with me one sec. Good enough for now. And what I'll do, since I'm going to come back into the sky to give that a little more time to dry before I go in with the trees, I'm going to go in and put some warmth into this highlight area and get rid of these whites. There's really no direct, super bright white spots in this. Everything can kind of have a warm tint to it because I'm kind of picturing a low sun angle. So I'm kind of picturing the sun's like out this way and shining in kind of a low angle. But I do want to put some warmth in here. Okay. I'm going to do a really light wash on the front and roof. And then very light in here. And then it'll get darker as I come down into the foreground. And since I'm done with this mix for now, I'm going to go ahead and use this for my blue mix. I'll start adding some yellow and maybe some burnt sienna into this, but I'll keep using this puddle. But for clear yellow ochre, I'll do that. Water. And I'm going to come across this part first, and then I'll work up into the building and then down. I kind of have a natural break here anyway, so I can use that to my advantage. And I don't want this very light. There's a lot of water in here. I'm going to go right up into there. Just using a little bit of a thicker mix here that I already have for those trees, just to drop some of that down in the bottom there. I'm going to grab a smaller soft brush to get up into the barn here. And this is going to be painted over with gray on the top half of this part, but I don't want any white showing through. I want this warmth. So that's why I'm putting this down first. And I can leave some highlights around the windows. There's going to be dark. I'll be coming back around those anyway. And I know there's still some moisture in here, so I'm trying to be careful about getting into that blue area. Oh, great. So now I've kind of set the shadow. The sky's done, basically. The light. I have my base color in here in the foreground. And what I'll do probably, I'm going to keep working. I don't need to really do anything more with this light yet. I can leave that there for now. I just wanted to get that base area, and I'm going to go ahead and finish this foreground by continuously working in thicker paint and adding a little bit of cobalt blue to my yellow ochre to make it graduate and get darker down here at the bottom. And I want to kind of leave some texture, a little highlight, a little interest. And then because the light's hitting this side of the barn, there's going to be a cast shadow that's barely visible, but it's going to go right across that strip there. And I'll paint that in later, but I'm just keeping that in mind. There's going to be, actually, I guess I can drop it in now. Actually, let's do a little, and it's just going to be a green mix, like a darker green mix of cobalt blue and yellow ochre. But I'm trying to keep these more on the warm side. I like the warm and cool, and the green can sort of go one way or another. Drop a little hint of something in there just so it's soft. And knocking out those whites. There we go. That'll work for that. And since I've got some green mixed, I can go ahead and just, I'm going to mix up a thicker dark green for the bigger brush here. But while I've got it on this brush, I'll throw some in where I want some smaller, lighter marks in the top here. This is just random, sort of like I would with like soft ripples in water. This is just going to give me some variation, kind of bridging the gap between the highlight area and the darker area down here. But I'm going to create a puddle of thick, darker green with just yellow ochre and cobalt blue. And then in like a sketchy fashion, I want to just randomly drop in thicker lines down here at the bottom and then make them thinner and smaller as I get up to the top. And so I'm going to work from bottom to top because it'll naturally help me eliminate the paint from the brush as I work my way up. But I like a little entryway of light coming in. And then because this is all wet, it's still damp. I'll get some nice soft edges. And then even because I'm on a tilted angle, I'm going to tilt it up a little bit more. I just, instead of moving my board, I tend to just use tape to lift up the back end of the board, give me a more steeper angle. But what that's going to do is it's going to let the water run down, and I'm going to start to get a feathery texture in here. I can already see it forming, but it just gives like a grassy look, I think. And I kind of like, I'm going to let this dry. I may come back and glaze over this later on, but I like the light that I have there. And because I have a tendency to blot out all my light when I'm trying to save it in situations like this, I'm going to err on the side of it. Let it sit. There we go. All right, I like that. Oh, and one more touch for this. What I'll do is Let's see, grab a scrap piece of paper. All right, place this. And I'm just going to cover the top part of that. And with my toothbrush, just get that wet. Pick up some of this dark paint. Make it a little thicker. There we go. And now, while I'm moving, I want to kind of lightly spritz, or I'm sorry, just flicking the end of the bristles here. And I want to kind of keep the bulk of that down in the lower half. It just adds a little texture. And if you get some spots that, like up in here, it's a little too big for that far back, you can use a damp brush and just knock it down a little. But that's it. I'll hit it with a little fine mist sprayer. Help those kind of settle in. And I'm gonna leave that for now. I'll hit this with a hairdryer real quick. I'm gonna come back in and put this tree shape in. And like I said, I'm gonna work from left to right. I'm gonna have different puddles that I'll be working from: a dark puddle, a light puddle, a cool, and a warm. And I'm just gonna vary it as I go, and I'll mix and drop warm into cool and whatnot as I'm going, just to kind of blend it all in. But I really just want to work on this shape of background trees and work it around the silo and the barn. I'm going to keep this brush handy and damp so I can soften some edges. I'm basically going to be using this brush, nice kind of a stiff brush, synthetic, that give me some nice control around these edges. Can't really see it here, but I can still see my lines for this silo. So what I'll probably do is I may come in maybe after I'm done the trees and just I'll wet and lift a little bit out of here just to separate it from the sky. But once I come in with details too, that might pop a little more, but I might want to just recover a little bit of light from that. But yeah, I'm just kind of planning out my tree shape here. I want to keep there's a larger bush in the foreground. There's another bush in the background that wraps around the silo, and then some trees that pop out in front and then go that way. So what I'll do to start here is I'm going to mix up a nice warm puddle, mostly yellow ochre. And that'll kind of act as my lights in the trees. And I can come back in with dark, cool colors or even dark, warm colors and create some shadows and different depth in the trees. So I have what I think is kind of a nice, natural, almost an olive green, but leaning towards the yellow. And I want to make sure I have enough. Let's see, so I'll make some more here. Easy enough too, because I'm only working for 2 colors. If I need to make more, I can do that. But what I'll do is I'm going to start this bush over here. And you can see what I did in this sample as I kept that warmer, made that cooler to push that back. Probably went a little darker there than I wanted to, but either way, it's more, the value is really, you want to have some separation there. And yeah, so it's kind of shape we're going for here. Time is 30. I'm going to try and cruise through this. I think I'm falling behind on my timeline, so bear with me. But really just expressive, loose brush strokes, keeping a nice rough edge. Like I said, I can come back in and soften some of that if I need to. And then I want this to, there's this background plane where these background bushes end, but this one and this tree that's in the foreground will come down a little further. It's good. I'm gonna go a little cooler in the background here. And I'm just gonna kind of paint in a rough shape around this foreground bush. And I know the side of the silo's there. Got to do that. I'll come in and put some shadows in here. Right down to that ground plane. Up to that wall. And then just a rough edge on the front here where the weeds and whatnot are growing around this silo. And I'll just soften some of that. I'm going to come back in and put a shadow in here and connect all that. So I'll also soften that. And then using a slightly smaller brush, but the same style, and just put some of that same color back here. Just a little hint. And then soften the top. Back to some warmth. But not quite as warm as that. Let's see. To help myself out here, I'm going to put a little piece of tape down right on that roof line, just lightly. And that will allow me to start on the tape and work my way up. So I'm still getting some texture without painting over the roof of the barn. More warmth in here. And I'm just thinking about interesting shapes. That helped. And then the rest of this, I'm just going to paint around. But come back in. Again, I'm going back into my palette and getting some greener paint, some darker, cooler mix. And then just creating an interesting edge here. And I'm just going to paint this all as one big shape and just tapping into different parts of my puddles for some variation in color. I do want to be careful right up on the side of the barn here. What's that? I like the dry brush edge there. I'm going to just overlap that warm area. That'll get a nice rough edge on that. And come back in and just overlap, leaving some sky holes. Just rough tree shapes. Not even tree shapes, really. It's almost just a wall at that point. But what I'm going to do is I'll, for a little interest and to kind of block off the edge here, I'll just put a couple pine tree shapes in. And just hinting at the shape. Spinning the brush, using the point to give me some edge textures that I want. But that's really it. Come back in and just try and create, like I said, I'm just trying to think of interesting edges and shape here. That's it. Background tree done. For a little variety, I'll just spritz a little. I have some soft edges there. I'll come in and soften some of that. That's it. Do a little bit of fine tuning. I like that there are some holes, sky holes and trees right above the roof line. I just want to clean that up just a touch. There we go. $10:35. I think we're back on track. Let's see. I'm definitely going to glaze this later on. I'll just run basically probably clean water, maybe a little bit of yellow ochre, and then down into a darker green, but just to put some more emphasis on that. But I really like what's happening there. I'm going to come back in. There's just that weird shape that popped up there. I'm going to just try and lightly throw some leafy stuff on top of that. There we go. Great. That's it. In the end, too, I can come back in and I can try and put some more darks in these trees if I want to, but really kind of like how they're setting back. I'm going to go ahead real quick and I'll, that's dry enough. I'm going to glaze this real quick just to get that out of the way. And then the rest of it's just going to be the details in the barn and silo. Let me do that real quick. Since I've got the green paint here, what I'll do is I'm going to just, I'll kind of cover the trees. I'm going to spray water in this area instead of brushing it. It's just quicker. And I don't need a lot. And then with a soft, large brush, I want to just lightly glaze over. Get kind of a nice thick mix here. Since I have moisture on the paper, I don't need that extra moisture there. But I want the value. And then I'll squeeze the excess out of my brush. Give it a quick rinse. I don't need to rinse it clean, but just to get the darker paint out of there. And then I'll come in with just yellow ochre. And put that right across this. And I'm touching the darker green when I do that. I know that green is dry enough that I won't get a lot of movement, but if I get a little bit, that's okay. It'll just kind of blend together, which is fine. And then maybe just a little more in there. just to warm it up. And then darken that foreground. Good deal. Hit it with a hairdryer real quick, and then the barn and silo. So one thing I'm going to do is clean a little spot on my palette here, since I'm going to need some straight burnt sienna for some of the roof. I will need some gray, so I can leave that, and I'll clean these. So I don't think I need any more greens or anything. I will for that tree actually, but I can mix that in the end. Let's see. So I'm going to want a gray mix. That I use. And so what I'll do here is I'm going to do burnt sienna into my blue mix here. And that's mostly water at this point. So juice that up a little bit. There we go. That's a nice neutral. So that'll work for the front here. Do this door and windows. These windows will be very dark. There's some gray there. Hard to say if I'm gonna have to glaze that again, but we'll see. But to start, what I'll do, I'm gonna lift a little bit. I'm just a damp brush. I'm gonna put a little water down on the back edge of this silo and just kind of work it in a little bit and just touch it with a paper towel. So that'll give me a nice separation from the sky, and then I can come back in and put a shadow edge on there, nice and soft. Let's do. I'm going to choose a little bit of this blue mix. I'll keep it cool for that shadow. But kind of right down there. And then I just rinsed it off, and I'll come back just damp and soften. Just a little bit of a glow on the backside, I think, helps separate that. And I'm going to let that sit until it's dry. We'll come back and I'll put some details in that. I'll get this roof done. And that is pretty much straight burnt sienna, but I'm going to knock it back a little bit with some cobalt blue. And the top part, it's a soft brush that's not terribly loaded, but I'm going to go quickly and let the texture work with me here and just kind of, I want to leave some sparkle. And I'm just hinting at sort of the directions of the texture. And then I want to be careful of that edge. I don't want to get it on the front. So just like that. That looks pretty bright, sunny. And we're going to come in, there'll be another step. I'll come in with darker paint and put a little bit more texture in that, but just to give me kind of the base layer. And again, I want to keep that edge straight. So it's easier to work from the edge that you want to save and go down or away from it. And I've got this a little bit cooler, a little more blue in it, since this is on the shadow side. But I want this dry brush texture in there too. But I'm just checking to make sure my hand's clean before I put it down on here. so I can hit this edge. And you can, I'm letting my brush strokes work in the way of the sort of directional to give me that texture. But that's pretty good there too. I think that's great. I need to come down a little lower. I'm going to put a dark edge under here, a little shadow edge. Just burnt sienna, cobalt blue. And very lightly, just letting it just touch the paper. Give me a nice soft edge there. So it's going to connect the roof to the side of the building here. Where I'll come in with maybe a little more. Uh, yeah, again, just a mix of cobalt blue and a little burnt sienna. Kind of going for a cool, sorry, like a little bit of a warmish neutral. The cool is there already. And since it's transparent, we'll be able to see it, but I do want some warmth to come through. So I've got kind of a warm neutral color, and I'm just touching that darker edge. And then to keep some reflected light, rinse the brush and just let clean water soften that all the way down. There we go. That's good. I'll let that dry. I'll work on this part. Again, I just need a neutral. And I want that to be a little bit on the warm side because it's getting the sunlight. So I might put a little bit of the yellow ochre. There's just some in my palette here. I'll just use that. And for this, what I want to do is these are boards that are vertical. So I'm gonna paint vertical boards and give myself some lines. I'm leaving a little gap along this roof edge. There'll be a shadow on this side, but there's not a shadow on that side. So I just want to leave a little bit of an edge and keep those from overlapping. But letting the brush and the texture of paper work for me. And again, I'm starting from the edge that I want to save and then working back this way. These windows are going to be dark, so I'm not terribly concerned with that, but I don't want to get into this area. I want to keep that light. And now I'm working from this edge up. I've left some details in there. I'm going to use I'm just going to rinse and use the same brush. I'll just come back and with a little water on there, I'll soften that. I'll soften that. That's great. And then there's also almost like this color on the door here. So I'm going back to this puddle, a little thicker, cooler mix, just getting a little darker value gray, just to make this part stand out. And I'm gonna leave a little gap so I'm not touching what's already wet. But since I can, I'll get that shape in now. And then another quick blast with a hairdryer so I can the cooler side. There we go. So I'm rotating my board 90 degrees because it's easier for me to get straight edges kind of going side to side instead of trying to paint them vertically this way. I just find it easier to keep the shape right. There's that. Just and then I'll give myself a nice dark mix and just very lightly add some sketchy dark lines to this eave here. And I don't want it too strong. So just with a damp brush, I'm coming back and just touching that bottom edge, let it soften out. Looking back to the silo, I'll put some rust colors in there. And what I'm going to do is I'll use a 1/2 inch flat brush with basically pure burnt sienna. And that's I'll draw it with a nice thicker than that. There we go. So what I'm going to do is, this is kind of a weird thing, but because we're on a curved surface and we're looking at perspective, the top lines here kind of arc a little bit. And then they get flat as we get closer to the horizon. So to do that, I'm going to put a little bit of a curve on my brush, just using my fingertip, just so it's not straight. And then just lightly touch. I'm going to touch there, there, and I'm going to get a little flatter as I go. And I'm going to tilt the brush. I don't know if you can tell, I'm tilting the brush so I'm not getting a full line where these trees are. And then I'm going to tilt the brush again. And on this sunny side, I'm just going to put a little hint. That's almost enough as it is. But there's this channel that runs down the side. So I hint at that as well. And then soft brush, damp brush, just come in and touch some of these and just help them sit in place. But I think that's all I need for a silo. I like the light on that. A little bit of texture detail here. What I'll do is I'm just kind of using whatever I have in my palette, a little bit of a darker gray mix. I'm going to take some of the paint off the brush. I'll turn my board sideways or at an angle, whatever's most comfortable to get straight lines here, but just ever so slightly touching the paper here and there. These are so light And maybe from this top part, I'll work down a little bit. But just hinting at some vertical boards on that side of the barn. And then there's a little detail. Actually, I'll do these windows first, give that a chance to dry. So we are getting towards the end here. Bear with me. Nice, thick, dark mix. And these are just little marks. I'm not even making rectangles or squares or anything. They're just kind of vertical brush marks where these windows are. And I'm going to kind of make them thinner and smaller to go with the perspective as they go back. And I'll separate them a little bit just to create a little visual interest, but that's it. That's all that needs. I'll take a little paint off the brush, give this door a little something, something, little hinge, little something. And then back to the flat brush. Quick rinse, doesn't matter if it's got some burnt sienna in it. I'm going to use some of this dark mix as well. I'm just controlling what's in the brush, any moisture. And then very lightly above these windows and below, just tapping to put some horizontal lines in there. One last little, well, maybe a couple last little things. But there's a utility pole that sticks up over here. And it's in the ground. So we'll create a little footing for it. A little something where it's sitting. Light's coming this way, so there will be a shadow that goes across. Just do like that. I'm going to reinforce the shadow really quick while I have this little mix just over here. And these are just last little details, but I've got straight burnt sienna on my brush. That's the roof is all dry. I just want to add in some punches of color here. And so I'm moving my hand backwards. I have my brush at an angle that matches the roof line, this angle. And I'm just lightly tapping the brush right along that edge, not the top part, and just letting the brush touch the paper here and there. And that'll create a little more interest. And then there's a lip that kicks out at a little bit more of an angle at the bottom, just above that. I'll come back and do the same thing. Just random. I'm not even looking at the top part. I'm just looking along here. But just tap, tap, tap. Tap, tap, tap. And then in a couple spots, I'll do the same thing on the top. Just for some variation. And we're so close. A little hint of roof there. There's a shadow under here, under this eave. It just needs a little touch with the flat brush. I'm going to reinforce this. With some darks down there. Oh. So we are 5 after 11. One last quick little thing, just a dark mix. Doesn't need to be black, just dark. Like a dark gray is fine. But we want it to be dark enough to stand out against the sky. And then right around this silo here, I'm just going to put teeny little marks. I'll put some sitting on the silo. But just some birds flying around. A little parallel. I could keep messing with it, but I think we're in a pretty good place here. Again, in a plein air situation, it's capturing the light. And so making connections is always nice to do. So painting the shadow, sky color right through the shadow of the building and the silo, capturing the highlights, keeping some light. And again, you know, looking at the reference photo, it's a pretty drab, semi uninteresting. I like the barn itself, but the scene and the sky is not very interesting. There's not interesting light in it, but we can do that using the photo as a reference and our imagination and creative license, artistic license, whatever you want to call it, to create light, which I think makes a much more interesting scene.
The right side of that power pole, if we could get a very light, and I don't know how you would get that white, and that would really bring it out.
100%. And I'll show you actually what I would do because it's still wet. I didn't want to mess with it, but I'll hit it with a hair dryer real quick and then I'll show you how I get that highlight.
Okay.
Yeah, it just needs just a quick dry. But what I would do for a highlight for that, and that's a great point, Larry, because it's dark against dark, it's not really standing out very well. But I would use my flat brush, a small 1/2 inch flat, with enough water, get a nice crisp, sharp edge on it. And then just like you said, on the right hand side of this, I would just put the brush down and wiggle a little bit just to work the water into the paint, loosen the paint up a little bit, and then touch it with a
Mm.
little paper towel to lift that out. And actually, what I'll do real quick too, I forgot about this in the last one. In these kind of situations, I think it's cool to see it without the tape on it. But normally, when I do a painting, I will let it dry for maybe 2 days before I take the tape off, just to guarantee that it stays as flat as possible. But I have noticed that with Arches paper, I can work really wet and it dries pretty flat. But there's a little
Mm.
cleaner view. Did anybody try the paint along?
I did not this time.
Okay. Well, if for anyone who does, if you finish up after the fact, feel free to email me if you want some feedback on it. I'm happy to do that through email. I know it's tough to finish it, to watch the demo and finish the painting at the same time. So if anyone who does do the painting, if you want to send it to me after the fact in an email, like I said, I'm happy to do some feedback for you. Or if you have any questions or anything like that as well, just feel free to let me know.
Will you be adding that bush or tree that goes in between the windows?
Oh, thank you, Larry. That's right. You may have in the photo that I posted, I actually photoshopped it, but that tree in the original, there's only one window here in the door. There was a tree. That tree is right there in the original photo, right smack dab center of composition. So I just shifted it over here to push it
Yeah.
toward that
Okay.
edge. But yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. Thank you for reminding me. I can do that. Luckily, those pine trees are quick to do. You just need a nice thick dark mix. I've got yellow ochre, cobalt blue. I'm going to put a little bit of burnt sienna in it to just knock it down, neutralize it, and give it a little bit more body and darkness. But yeah, so similar to this tree existing on this plane versus that plane, this tree exists on this plane as well. So it's going to come down to about that level and up about this high. I don't want to go, I'm trying to think, I don't want to go right in the middle of this space. So I'll go a little taller and somewhere right in there. And then let's try and use some brush work to get some nice shape to it. Yeah. And then a little, I should need to get the water on my brush. I really want very little water on my brush at this point because I want a nice dark, but the same mix. So just darken it up. Little blue, little cobalt blue, little burnt sienna. And then it still has that, still leaning green because that's the puddle I was using. And then I'll come in on the shadow side of this and add just a little bit of depth to it. Something like that. So there is just a little bit of a shadow edge on that. But yeah, thank you, Larry, for mentioning that. That adds to the depth. And then to ground it as well, I will just give it a little bit of a shadow. Yeah, there's other adjustments I could do. I could go in and add a little bit more detail in here, but it's really the silo is not the main star of the show here. It's the barn. So as long as I have detail, the windows, there's like contrast. I have some detail in here. There's a nice little touch that there's kind of a door that's sort of sitting open up on that art. But these kinds of little details, you know, if I was painting this plein air, I'd probably pack it up, take it home, let it dry, and then put these kinds of details in. But these are all little things to just sort of reinforce that that's the area of interest. And in this, you know, you've got the L-shaped composition, basically, the vertical and horizontal, multiple points of interest because I have an area of contrast and a contrast and detail here, as well as here. So it just gives you a little couple different places to draw your eye and move your eye around the scene. But yeah, again, it's just a kind of a basic scene, but it's about trying to add interest to something that is not in itself the most interesting photo. During the demo, this is the point I got to at the end there. After about an hour or a little more, it's always the case. It's nice when you get to a point, get away from the painting, walk away, spend some time doing something else, and come back and look at it with fresh eyes. And as soon as I came back and looked at this, and I think I mentioned at some point during the demo that I might want to do it, but I'm going to reinforce the shadow on this side of the silo, and also it's going to connect into the shadow, the cast shadow from the barn on the silo, and then I'm going to connect all that, and I'm going to glaze this whole side of the barn and darken this value. It's just not the, it's almost where it needs to be. It's in the right direction, but making this darker is really going to emphasize the light here and there. I'm going to leave this on the cooler side. So I'll go in my shadow color, and then with a damp, clean brush, I'm just going to soften that edge. And I want some definition still on this side of the shadow. And I think the timing is kind of working in my favor, but just touching that edge a little bit. There we go. And then I'm going to keep using the soft brush. And I'm going to connect that shadow, which will go right through there. You'll see that cast shadow there under the roof. And then I'll switch to a flat brush and lightly glazing. Try not to disturb the tree too much. And then one of the details I want to add too is after I try and lift some of that. There we go. And gone. Let's see. I'm going to reinforce those shapes just a little bit. Just a couple brush strokes. That's too much. Lift some of that. There we go. Come back in. Just touch that up. Soften some of that. Since I've got a spot up in the sky over here, I'm going to go ahead and just make it a bird. But I'm always thinking about directions with these kinds of things. Like I wanted these birds kind of coming this way. I'll have this bird kind of going that way. So, just right like that. A smaller one there. And we should have a friend or two, so. Couple other dots over here I'll use. There we go. And I think this contrast is much better. And while I'm here, I'm going to come in and drop some more shadow on this bush here. Get rid of those highlights. soft brush. Just modify some of those edges. Softening here and there. That just gives a little bit more form to that. I want to get mostly burnt sienna, but knock it back a little bit with some cobalt blue, neutralize it, and sort of just take some of the bright red out of it, but still pretty close to burnt sienna. And need a dark strip right across here. Do it all in one go. There we go.